This is Mr. Hasdovic's World History Online Lecture Series, Lecture Number 6, The Conclusion and Significance of World War I. By the time the last shot had been fired in World War I on November 11, 1918, the world was more than ready for peace. People around the world were simultaneously ecstatic at the war's end, but also quite mournful. The prior 4 years had been arguably the bloodiest ever seen in the world up to that moment. More than 10 million soldiers and civilians had been killed by the war. Millions more had been displaced as the war destroyed their cities and homes. The continent of Europe was left broken, destitute, and in many places, starving. On the other hand, people had much to rejoice in, especially if they supported the liberal ideas of democracy, capitalism, and international cooperation, as all of these liberal notions would receive a tremendous political boost after the war's conclusion. World War I would also set in motion the wheels that would return Europe and the rest of the world to war only 20 years later in 1939, as it would also impose contradictory, harsh punishments upon Germany. Russia would be utterly transformed by the war in ways that Western nations like England, France, Germany, and the United States would only fear. And the promise of liberation and the end of imperial colonies would only end for those in Europe, not those in Asia, Africa, or Latin America. Counting the dead. When we last met at the beginning of World War I, we saw a Europe mobilized and motivated to fight a world war. Nationalism created the sentiments of extreme pride in one's nation and extreme hatred for one's foes. Militarism used the power of industrialization to build the largest armies outfitted with the most powerful weapons the world had ever known. Imperialism brought European empires into direct conflict with each other, as colonies represented wealth and power. Alliances tied almost all European nations into one of two opposing camps, the Central Powers and the Triple Entente. Young men by the millions had enlisted to fight what most thought would be a short war. However, as the months turned into years, millions of those soldiers were either killed by the fighting or were forever transformed by the war, often physically because of the wounds they brought home, but also emotionally by the horrors they saw. World War I was akin to a meat grinder that chewed up and spat out so many countless thousands of young men. In total, some 65 million troops were mobilized to fight on either side of World War I. This number was larger than the population of most European nations at that time. Never before had so many fought or died. Over 13 million soldiers and civilians died in this war, nearly 20% of all who had enlisted. Austria suffered the highest casualty rate, as nearly 90% of its fighting forces were killed, injured, or taken prisoner. Russia and France both suffered roughly 75% casualties. Germany suffered a 65% casualty rate. By comparison, the United States' 8% casualty rate would seem almost trivial, despite the fact that its 8% accounted for over 50,000 American deaths. Over $186 billion in 1914 dollars had been spent fighting the war. Adjusted for inflation in 2010, this means that if the war were fought only 2 years ago, the world would have spent some $3,998,580,000,000. This is money that could have been spent fighting disease, invested in each nation and its people, instead of used to kill. It's impossible to estimate with any precision how much property was destroyed by the war because it was so widespread, especially on the Eastern Front. However, in France, nearly 10,000 square miles of cities, villages, farmland, factories, and forests were destroyed. That included the destruction of 300,000 homes and the death of more than 1.3 million head of livestock. Immediately after World War I's conclusion, France was literally destitute and starving as millions of its people were without food or shelter. Wars, however, can be measured in terms of their effects in many other ways. Next, let's take a look at how the end of World War I was positive, especially for the liberal nations around the world. Since the world's liberal nations emerged victorious from World War I, it meant that their way of life would dominate. England, France, and the United States, all democracies which practiced capitalism, got to dictate the way that the post-war world would look, and they sculpted it in their own image. Out of the Versailles Treaty, which was the document that brought World War I to a legal conclusion, and one about which you will hear much, much more, came new international laws. Chief among these was the freedom of the seas. The victorious Allies decreed that all nations should have free use and navigation of all the world's major seas and oceanic waterways in order to promote more international trade. Classically, liberals at that time believed that international trade not only benefited all the nations involved with trading, but also helped to prevent war, as nations who traded with each other seldom wanted to go to war since war disrupts trade. The victorious nations also worked to reduce tariffs between nations so as to make international trade not only easier to engage in, but also less expensive for all involved. Laissez-faire, or hands-off capitalism, had won out in World War I, and gradually, most European nations switched to economies that promoted industrialization and trade, while also shunning any government interference or regulation of the economy. As we now know, that practice wouldn't last. Each of these three countries had a strong democracy by the end of World War I, and as such, wanted to bring it to nations who were once ruled by empires. Therefore, all European empires, specifically the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, were dissolved, and all of the nations who were once a part of such large empires were given their own independence. This meant that students at this time had a brand new map of Europe to learn about. It should be noted, however, that only those nations in Europe who were members of empires were liberated. Nobody liberated European colonies in Africa nor Asia, and this would cause a great deal of resentment soon enough. Along with the expansion of democracy came the expansion of people who got to participate in democracy, namely women. In 1918, England gave women over the age of 30 full voting rights, while the 19th Amendment passed in the United States in 1920, allowing women over the age of 18 to vote. French women got partial suffrage, but would have to wait until after World War II for full voting rights. The biggest liberal victory from World War I was arguably the creation of the League of Nations. This organization was initially started by 65 different nations right after World War I with one singular purpose: maintaining world peace. The League of Nations would provide a venue for nations to work not only with each other, but with other nations around the world in order to solve conflicts peacefully without resorting to war. Now, the fact that there was a Second World War does inform us just how successful this institution was in obtaining its goals. But that's an issue we'll tackle later in class. The main point is that for the first time in the world's history, an organization like this was created with such a lofty purpose and lofty ambition. World War I's negative effects. Despite the fact that liberal nations won the war, that democracy prevailed over monarchy, not all of the decisions the victorious Allies made would reflect the spirit of such noble goals. Many of the effects, especially for Germany, of the Versailles Treaty would be most decidedly negative. First and foremost, Germany, along with its ally Austria, were not even invited to the Paris Peace Conference at which the Versailles Treaty was written. That meant they would have no say in what its terms were. The Versailles Treaty was brutal toward Germany. Since Germany had violated international agreements early in the war, both by invading Belgium, who was neutral, and directly attacking and killing non-combatant civilians, the Allied powers thought they were justified in their brutal treatment of Germany. England, France, and Belgium especially were more than happy to use this moment of victory to crush Germany once and for all. They did so first by imposing a massive war debt of $35 billion that they would owe the Allies. Now, Germany had just fought and lost the world's most expensive war ever. They were broke, and as we will see in the weeks ahead, This just ended making them more broke. Germany lost all of its colonies around the world to the Allies. Britain and France got its holdings in the Middle East and Africa, while Japan, whose participation in World War I barely registered as a blip, got all of Germany's possessions in China and the Pacific Ocean, which made that nation an enormous imperial power in their own right. Germany was demilitarized, which meant it was forbidden from being able to form any army. It could only use 100,000 troops to police itself, and in the era in which armies were measured by the millions, this was just a trifle. Germany's navy was dissolved, and its submarine fleet lost. Most humiliatingly, Germany had to accept the Versailles Treaty's war guilt clause, which stipulated that Germany was solely responsible for starting World War I and causing all of its destruction and bloodshed. As we well know, Germany didn't start the war at all. They didn't always play by the fair rules of war, but they didn't start it. This part of the Versailles Treaty was solely included to shame and humiliate Germany and its people. Russia, who had surrendered to Germany a year and a half before the war's conclusion in 1917, was also not invited to the peace conference, largely because immediately after their surrender, radical communists had overthrown and executed Russia's monarch, which then started a 5-year-long civil war for the control over Russia's future. By 1922, the communists had won their civil war, and as such had made Western European nations fear them even more. Because of this, all the land that Russia had surrendered to Germany in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was never returned to Russia, but instead made into new independent nations such as Poland. While all of the empires in Europe, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, were broken up into individual nations who each had the right to rule themselves, colonies in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America were not freed. Germany's colonies only became British, French, or Japanese colonies. Those people had produced and fought for the victory of colonial powers, but were given no rewards for their efforts. Feelings of resentment, betrayal, and ultimately nationalism rose tremendously as a result throughout colonies around the world. It is at this time that a former English-trained lawyer named Mohandas K. Gandhi would make a name for himself by fighting peacefully, first for the cause of Indian treatment in South Africa, and then for the cause of Indian independence. Although not directly caused by World War I, the Great Depression would be a direct result of the peace imposed by the victorious Allies at the Versailles Conference. The Versailles Treaty, as discussed earlier, encouraged expansion of capitalistic economies, specifically without any government interference or regulation in those economies. The greed and corruption that ran through international banks, stock markets, and industries as a result directly led to the great crash of the American stock market in 1929, which would then ripple out and crash Europe's stock markets and create massive global unemployment, the likes of which we haven't seen since. Aside from the dead and wounded, the survivors who had fought in World War I also carried a heavy burden. Millions were emotionally scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. Many returned home completely changed men who couldn't find happiness and joy in life anymore. Others suffered from nightmares, hallucinations, nervous tics and twitches, conditions which would more recently be understood as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. However, in the years following World War I, we not only didn't understand PTSD, but we had no idea how to treat it. These young men were called by the American writer and critic Gertrude Stein the Lost Generation, because World War I had taken away their hearts, their souls, their very manhood by its brutality. It deprived them of the opportunity to grow from boyhood to manhood normally and peacefully, and instead, through the random violence of artillery, chemical weapons, and machine guns, ushered them into a manhood that seemed unable to find any peace. These members of the Lost Generation detested warfare and all that had brought it into existence. Many would find an outlet for their sentiments in artistic expression. American authors, such as Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, wrote about how the war negatively affected men and culture. Their characters owed no allegiance to governments and had no desire to fight for any other reason than to prove their manhood. They certainly would never fight for a country or flag. Dadaism was a radical new form of art in which artists such as Marcel Duchamp mocked all the past methods of creating art because of how art itself had contributed to the propaganda which encouraged so many millions of men to march off to their deaths. Musicians like Cole Porter and Louis Armstrong encouraged people to turn away from the affairs of the world. That only brings you misery. Instead, they encouraged people to turn inward, enjoy good music, fun dancing, both with a pretty woman. The worst consequence of World War I, however, was that all of these negative effects helped set in motion the elements that would cause the second and far bloodier World War just 20 years later. A humiliated and deeply enraged Germany would find the means for revenge under the leadership of Adolf Hitler and his new form of government fascism. Joseph Stalin, in the nation formerly known as Russia, now known by the acronym USSR, or Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, would not be so quick to ally with the West. The United States had decided to return to its isolationist roots after the war and refused to be a part of the League of Nations, as well as take any sort of leadership role in world politics that might have actually helped put a stop to the rise of the Nazis early on. Japan, whose empire had expanded to the borders of the United States Empire, now began to feel more threatened and intimidated than ever before by the presence of the United States in Pacific islands such as the Philippines, Hawaii, and Guam. Japan began putting into motion a plan to crush the United States, if not at the very least, its Pacific imperial possessions, in one swift massive attack. World War II would clean up and resolve much of the mess that World War I and the Versailles Treaty left behind, but at an even greater cost of roughly 60 million lives and destruction that is impossible to fathom. What we will next focus on in class is the route that led us to the Second World War, and what paths that would then open up for later generations.